that with the Bluegrass Festival and a big influx of visitors on the East End, that was of grave concern. The commissioners asked him to get back in touch with our district ranger and to discuss whether or not it made sense to go ahead and accelerate that, even though we haven't hit those trigger points, to go regularly into a fire ban if it made sense to do so. He was able to meet with our district ranger, Megan Eno, and that her feeling was that they are not going to do campground fire restrictions in the East End. Her rationale was that the elevation is much higher, the temps are cooler, and the fuel moistures are up. And he had spoken about those ERCs, which is basically, and the threshold of the 96% trigger mark, they are in the mid 80s for the East End. So she didn't feel that any of the metrics were of danger. And so then he weighed, should he consider implementing a fire restriction for the unincorporated non-federal on the East End. And he thought that that was going to lead to a lot of confusion and almost an impossible to enforce situation, because there would be a checkerboarding effect of which areas it applied to and which ones it didn't. So for those reasons, he's saying that he wants to hold off, and then he's going to be revisiting with them on Tuesday morning. And he will update us at that point if any of those trigger points have been met for a fire restriction moving forward. But I wanted to make you and the public aware that he did follow up on that request, and that the news is better than the original message he gave, which was for countywide. If you were to average the East and West ends, we know that typically our far West end is drier, it's lower, and oftentimes windier as well. So they often will go into a fire restriction before the East End, but even those areas are not at those trigger points yet.
Thank you for that update.
Yeah, and thanks to the sheriff for being so responsive. I'll say Lance and I were sitting in here doing email during the break, and Shannon Armstrong, our emergency manager, came through, and we expressed to her our concerns, and she shared a lot of that information with us. We also asked her to use the emergency alert system to get information out, and she said that makes sense. She also said that there are quite a bit of communication between her office and the Bluegrass Festival in terms of educating festivarians. And so I think we're doing everything we can at this point, given the standards that are in place and the cooperation that is taking place and needs to take place to have a stage 1 ban. So there we are.
Thank you.
Anybody want to add anything? Okay, thank you, Mike. I really appreciate that follow-up. All right, so now back to county housing matters and the deed restriction. So I just want to read this conflict disclosure statement. The following agenda item will involve discussion of deed restricted properties within San Miguel County and the operation of certain covenants and restrictions. In the interest of transparency and to address any perceived conflict of interest, I'd like to disclose on the record that I am an owner of deed restricted property within San Miguel County and have entered into a covenant with the county for that property. I do not believe this will impact my ability to remain fair and impartial for purposes of today's discussion.
Commissioner Brown, I'm in exactly the same position and share your sentiments.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, I think we're ready now. Jared.
Thank you, commissioners. I guess get this mic over into my face so you can hear me, or the folks out in Zoom land can hear me.
When your microphone when it's time.
We know we've been having close mic sharing needs all day today. So in any case, let me get my slideshow pulled up, get it running. Hopefully I am smoother this time, because it's always great to have one round of practice. So thank you for having me this morning, having more discussion this afternoon, and we will run over this probably with a little more speed just because we have been through it and I made the amendments to the slides that I made mistakes on. So hopefully Maura doesn't have to correct me quite as many times. So we're just gonna have a general overview. So first, just what our program purpose is and a big overview. Deed restriction summary and timeline of kind of what our history has been to get here. a little discussion of the 2023 covenant amendments and how there were not land use amendments at that time. Then we're going to talk about the deed restriction legal questions that were asked by the county through this process, and then the suggested next steps. And as I mentioned, each deed restriction is very specific, and I'm sure everybody who was at the meeting this morning ran home or to the clerk and recorder's office, read their deed restriction, and now it's crystal clear. I say that tongue in cheek, obvious, but it will not be the same from neighbor to neighbor, from neighborhood to neighborhood. So it's just another point to make that we have to read the documents to make sure we know exactly what each situation is. So, big picture overview. What's the purpose of these deed restrictions to begin with? And in Land Use Code Section 5-1305, it spells out, and I highlight this section every time. These guidelines, rules, and regulations are intended to help preserve a sufficient supply of affordable housing to meet the needs of locally employed residents in the Telluride R1 school district. And then while allowing customary free market unrestricted practices to influence sale and rental of affordable housing as much as possible. So just always like to get the perspective of what are we doing here? What are we doing in these decisions? The big overview and the map showing the 267 deed restricted properties. Again, this number is probably slightly changed from last September, but I did not update the map between now and then. And it shows neighborhood by neighborhood what the breakdown is between those, the total number of units. So taking Two Rivers as an example, 46 units in Two Rivers. 22 of those are land use code and 24 of them are covenant, or at least this was as of last September. So additionally, I just point this out, there were special covenants that were written in places like Pinion Park, Rio Vistas, and a special ADU deed restriction that is specific to those scenarios. So when we talk about those, they are excluded from a lot of this conversation because they have a very specific requirement that was signed on for those developments. So, SMRHA and deed restrictions. So when I moved here a year and a half ago or more, it was like, what exactly is SMRHA and what are they doing? Just to state it, it's the Multi-Jurisdictional Housing Authority. It was formed, I think, originally by the town of Telluride and San Miguel County to manage deed restrictions in both of those jurisdictions. It continues to serve that purpose for both of those organizations. We did have a time when Mountain Village was also a partner, and their deed restrictions were managed in the same way. But they have broken off and gone their own direction, even though they have a lot of good coordination and conversation. As membership has changed in that organization, and as their priorities have changed because of market forces, increased inventory, a number of other factors, different priorities have come to the fore for SMRHA over the years, which has driven some of their focus and changes in their programming. So let's start talking about the land use code deed restriction. So this is the original deed restriction that existed. It was initiated in 1991, and it was done so via the land use code. So at least a two-step process to amend land use code. And it spelled out the language that is kind of the guiding star for the program, as well as other things like how employees are qualifying. That the deed restriction runs with the land for 50 years after recordation, with an optional extension of the BOCC. It prohibits of ownership of another residential property within the R1 school district, that it cannot be amended without consent of owners unless the amendment is less restrictive, and we'll talk more about that particular provision. there was a transfer fee of 2%, and that rental is allowed to qualified employees as well. So that was kind of the original, the meat of the original set of rules from that land use code deed restriction. But as I mentioned here, almost as soon as it was adopted, there were issues and, some of it had to do with financing, some of it had to do with people being concerned about how and who would purchase these opportunities, how to rent them. And as any good rule, when it's made, you figure out all the unintended consequences, and that's when amendments started to happen. There was an amendment to that even in 1991, that fall, and then that happened in 1992, I think 1993, 94. So there were a number of amendments throughout the 90s. And then there was a much more significant amendment in 2001, and that amendment removed that one piece of language I mentioned about that it cannot be amended without the consent of the owners. Now, we have some more inflection about that a little later in the presentation, but it's a good point to remember as we walk through this. So since 2001, there have been a few other amendments to the land use code, but about that year, there was a lot of concern and people wanted some more certainty in what they were getting with their deed restrictions. And so that's when folks started working on a covenant instead, a contractual relationship instead of relying on the referential land use code for their deed restriction. And so that is where we will move next. And of course, please stop me. Any questions you have, I know you guys are going to have them. So,
We've already been through this.
I know.
And had plenty of questions.
So the deed restriction covenant was developed and first adopted in 2010, the first template. And it has, as a contract deed restriction, it has been amended from time to time as well by the County Housing Authority. Most significantly, those templates were changed in 2016, 2021, and 2023. Looking at that original 2010, it spells out a lot of the same things that were in the land use code, but then there are some nuanced differences. So there's the local employee standard, very similar to the qualifying employee matters from land use code, that it continues until May 18th, 2042. So it has a specific date and doesn't have that 50-year language. Prohibits ownership in the R1 school district with a 1-year grace period to sell. And, that's now a pretty particular difference between land use code and the covenant, because the land use code has a 4-county prohibition on ownership, where the covenant has just the R1 still, depending on what version you are on. Again, a continuing residence standard, and that rentals must be at least 30 days and meet qualifying income or intent to qualify. So that's, again, the big outline, the meaty parts of what were in that original covenant. And there were amendments. I mentioned here in the 2016, or I think it was the 2021 version, there was the amendment, adjustment to the term of 100 years. And I looked tomorrow to see if I'm misstating that. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the 2023 amendments hereafter. So, big history lesson. It all sunk in, right?
We lived this.
So, and again, I always like visuals, so I just put a timeline together. That way, you can kind of conceptualize, when did I buy, or when was my house built, or when was my subdivision platted? And you could kind of think about where you may have been, or where your house may have been on this scale. So now we're at the process of reviewing deed restrictions and just a little bit of history again about the adoption of the current version of the covenant. So this is the current master template of the covenant. On July 5th of 2023, the County Housing Authority, the Board of Commissioners sitting as the County Housing Authority, had a meeting to consider amendments to the master covenant. And I mentioned at that point in time, there were land use code amendments that mirrored those changes that were prepared for that meeting, but because the process had not been gone through the two-step process with the Planning Commission and then the Board of County Commissioners, those land use code amendments could not be adopted at that time. Instead of pushing off both of those items, the commissioners at that time decided we'll consider the covenant changes and then we'll bring back the land use code amendments at a later date. There were some pretty significant changes to qualification and a few other things at that point in time, including an increase in the number of hours required for qualification going from 1032 to 1200. The minimum number and having those minimum number of hours within 8 months from 30 to 40. The hour requirements were conformed across retired, disabled, and unemployed scenarios. And there were some extended definitions or some clarifying definitions of qualified and non-qualified income in an attempt, because the income was the way a lot of folks were qualifying for local employment, right? That was the tool or the lens that was being used to administer these rules and qualify folks in a lot of ways. So there was an attempt to clarify that within this covenant. And so that was adopted at that meeting and is the current covenant template on file at SMRHA. So switching gears, we say what happened to that land use code amendment that we kind of put on the side at that point in time? Well, it had its hearing at the Planning Commission on June 13th of 2024, and then was provided at the Board of County Commissioners sitting as the Housing Authority on the 3rd of July, or the 10th of July, rather, of 2024. And that is really one of the bigger kind of points where you commissioners said, after hearing a lot of public input and having a lot of questions, decided to say, let's hold tight. Let's not adopt these amendments. Let's have a little bit more conversation and let us to a little bit of a holistic look at the program in September of last year, and then where we have kind of come to as of now. So we got comment letters for both that Planning Commission and for that Board of Commissioners meeting that had a lot of great questions. And we began kind of a legal review of that. As you know, we had quite a bit of staff turnover after that point, particularly from November through about January, when we got our current team fully on board, I believe. So we've been doing that research and getting our ducks in a row. And here's where we are today with asking, answering those questions and suggesting changes to our practices. So,
As I recall, the staff turnover included the county attorney, the county housing authority attorney, San Miguel Regional Housing Authority attorney, and director of San Miguel Regional Housing Authority, correct?
And there was actually 4 different directors at SMRHA, because there was an interim period between the time Shirley Diaz left the post and Pam Schifrin, our current executive director, was hired.
Right, I was just thinking
But-
though, since
but
September of
particularly
last year,
since September.
we've had all sort of the 4 key players in all of this have turned over, so. we understand, or I understand why it was 9 months happening.
It is a good point. I was not hired to work specifically on.
No.
I think, I think it's also important for folks to know, we sought 3 different outside counsel reviews of this. Because we wanted to confirm we heard one opinion, we heard a second opinion that gave some questions. We hired another outside counsel trying to make sure that these were folks that already were from jurisdictions that had extensive experience in land use code evaluation and deed restrictions. So it took a little bit of time to find them. We also had to get all 3 of their opinions, and then we felt confident in the direction, seeing that confirmation.
So as we move, we will discuss the questions we asked, so to speak. So the first question was, does a land use code deed restriction apply based on the code as it existed at the time of the deed restriction or a vintage, or would it be subject to a changing land use code? And as Mike mentioned, we overwhelmingly heard that the land use code that applied to a property, I'm wigging out, my apologies. The applicable land use code at the time of a property transaction would apply to the owner. And clarification from this morning's conversation was, when I say property transaction, it is when some of these are when the plat was filed, right, and had that deed restriction in it. Some of them may be when the house was constructed and deed restricted. You know, there are different scenarios when those were actually filed and vest on that property, if I'm using the word vesting correctly. So
So the way I understand it, oh, please, Lena,
No,
you
no,
go ahead.
no.
No.
I just, in layman's terms,
you.
it's when the deed restriction went into place on any given property.
when the first deed restriction went into place on any property. So
That's when the land use code that was in effect at that time.
Correct.
Continues to be in effect. Thank you.
correct.
Unless
Unless it
the
has been amended.
Correct.
right? So, and that is the big caveat in all of this, is if anybody signed an agreement that changed those terms. Since then, that would be the thing that would have changed something. So,
And I think one thing we have talked about in this room with the public and one another is the idea of an evolving land use code. So as the land use codes evolve, which it often does, and it gets better and better, and hopefully, the property owner is not subject to that evolving land use code unless their particular deed restriction says as amended. And that appears to be the exception. So for the vast majority of people who are quote unquote on the land use code, the version of the land use code that they are on is the one that was in effect when that deed restriction was signed and recorded. I think
and I would almost kind of point to this timeline slide as kind of a visual aid for that of, I think it was pointed out this morning, if Aldesaro was 1994, right? You would be on a vintage of land use code from 1994 unless you've signed something else along the way, right? And yes, the land use code changed after that, but it does not affect your particular property unless you've signed something that changed it along the way.
and that finding is different from what all of us understood prior to this legal review. Because previously we thought that the land use code evolved and that's how we were handling it, but
Correct.
we have new information. Thank you.
So any other questions on the vintage of land use code? Nope. Great. The next one.
Let's hang on to it and we're gonna get to public comment.
The next question that we asked was, does a deed restriction, land use code or covenant, run with the land regardless of the transfer of property? And the answer to that was that the deed restrictions do run with the land and bind the parties to that restriction and their successors, assigns, or heirs to that restriction. Again, unless they sign something different, right? So that is, it runs with the land. And there has been a lot of question about that of, well, if it just applies to one owner and the next owner has some other version of the rules. And we clarified that that is not the case. So,
Okay, and just because there's a little bit of government ease in here, I would say that question is, does a deed restriction run with the land regardless of whether the land or the property sells? That's what you're talking about, or is passed on to somebody, that's what you mean by transfer of property.
correct.
So there's a different owner. Okay, it's not just with the owner, it's with the land or the property.
Right. And this is where we do again note as amended language. There are some nuances, and we heard this morning that there may be a story behind the as amended languages. We will have to figure that out. We'll have to look at those cases and see where they're at. But as of now, if it includes as amended language, that could change the or the land use code you'd be subject to as it changes, right? Any other questions? Good. The next third and final question that we asked is, for ownership qualification, would a new buyer be required to sign a new covenant, or do they have an option to retain the prior owner's deed restriction, be it a covenant or a land use code restriction? And it was again pretty clear in the opinions we received that we can offer, the county housing authority can offer a new covenant or a new deed restriction as an option, but when they are qualifying, an individual would still have an option of the previous owner's deed restriction that has moved with that property over time. Questions about that?
I like that last sentence. Maybe you want to just say that one out loud. So I think that is more layman's term to me and helps
Sure.
me understand this slide better.
Yeah, just that the county housing authority, or SMRHA, acting on our behalf, so to speak, can offer the newest covenant as preferable to the county. Again, we didn't adopt those changes for nothing. It wasn't good ideas behind them, but need to provide that the previous owner's deed restriction can also be used for qualification. So you have an option when you're looking to purchase a property. So with those three questions now answered, and as you mentioned, Commissioner Brown, a shift in some of that approach, we are, as staff, suggesting some changes moving forward. Some of those changes of suggested approach include that SMRHA will evaluate qualifications based on the current covenant or the previous owner's deed restriction for potential buyers. And I will tell you, I believe Pam has already started doing this, right? As soon as we got clear legal guidance, she conversed with Lane Thomason, who is the Housing Authority legal counsel, and they started implementing this right away to make sure people knew the options that were on the table for them when they were trying to qualify. Additionally, there are some considerations moving ahead. There have been some acknowledgements of a deed restriction that have been signed in the past, but it hadn't been as consistent. And I think it may have been a newer thing as well. So moving forward, I think there's a recognition that new buyers will need to acknowledge that. And we want to start to actually record those documents to ensure we have a clear title path and a way to research how things have progressed on any piece of property. Now, some of these are they're still work in progress. It's, there's going to be some technical items, and we heard that this morning, that title work seems to be an interesting science in and of itself, and we may need to work through some of those things. But I think the big concept stands that we know need to offer the two options on any given sale, and that we need to make sure that's understood and acknowledged and recorded. That way we don't end up in a question again. And goes without saying, everybody's different. So don't look over your neighbor's fence and say, I'm just like that person, right? It is going to be different.
May or may not be different.
Well, this is concerning new transactions. I do have the note in here that we are, and big thanks to Nancy and Maura for, they're working on compiling those land use codes because, as we discussed this morning, we didn't have a practice in the past of recompiling the land use code every time it was amended. And so we have a 1991 version, and then resolutions 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 to amend it for a number of years, and then another recompilation and a few amendments. And they are doing a yeoman's effort or person's effort to address that. And that will aid in research as people continue through these processes. So
we'll have different versions of the land use code available for people to look at that reflect all of the changes that were made over time. They'll be compiled into different versions. Is that correct? Something like that?
Something like that.
Something
We're
like that.
planning out exactly how we want to display the
Sure.
different iterations, but there will be, by date of amendment, here's the version that existed on this date and on the next date, and try to reflect how those changes were made the best we can.
Okay, thank you.
I almost envision it just like my time scale, and
Mm,
having the amendment dates where you can just go look at those documents from those dates as a potential. But again, it's quite a bit of effort, and we're unpacking it and trying to make it where it'll be a little easier to use. Thank you, Maura and Nancy.
yeah.
For sales that have happened in the past 3 years, we're talking about an option for reversion. So the previous slide, we're really talking about how we're acting moving ahead. This is how we're acting looking in the past. And so for our suggestion is that for properties that have sold over the past 3 years, which would start on June 1st of 2022, staff are ready to proceed and engage in a process to offer a reversion from the current covenant, if it was signed, to a previous version of the land use code that applied for those properties. This would be done at the same time as our compliance process that is upcoming, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next couple of slides.
Jared, could I interrupt for a moment?
For sure.
Just to make sure I heard you say it, but I don't know if everybody interpreted it the same way. For those folks that are eligible to go back, it would be to go back to the vintage of the land use code. That it's not that they would get to choose any vintage. It would be the vintage that was signed when the property originally was deed restricted, because not all properties were constructed at the same
I
time.
thought it was to go back to the vintage that the previous owner had in place.
It's to go back to whatever deed restriction was on the property at the previous owner. So some properties went from covenant to covenant. So if the person you purchased from was on the 2010 version of the covenant, that's what you would go back to, not all the way back to the beginning land use code.
Yeah, and I think of those permutations, there would be land use code to land use code, there would be land use code to covenant or covenant to covenant, those 3 permutations. and being able to step back one step, so to speak.
That's a good way to put it, to clarify it back one step. Yeah.
And that's not a preference of the county, that's the law, correct?
I would tell you, I do think it's a preference of the county. The world is your oyster as a board, but there are reasons that we changed those processes. And that there are reasons that people did pick some of those changes through time as well. You know, it's not that everybody was unwittingly making these selections. And so I think to that point, Commissioner Gleason, you could completely flip the table over and say, let's just write a whole new covenant and see if everybody will sign it. But I don't think that's the intention. That's not the intention of the program. It would be a wholesale change from what we are talking about. I know we're talking big changes, but it's not nearly that big.
Thanks.
So as I was mentioning, this would exclude some particular subdivisions or some particular deed restrictions. As I previously mentioned, Pinion Park, which most of the Pinion Park were kind of finally constructed and sold within this window. It would not apply to them because they have a specific deed restriction for that development. Rio Vistas, it's a little older, but they have a specific deed restriction. ADUs, as I mentioned in other areas, a specific deed restriction. So those would not be offered reversions because they are on a specific set restriction. So, and as mentioned, this would be undertaken at the same time as our compliance process. And covers, and this is some of the logic behind why we picked 3 years or why we're suggesting 3 years. It covers the applicable period of the newest covenant. So it covers everybody who is on the new covenant today. They would have an option. It covers the time frame of, and this is a term of art, right? I said enhanced compliance. It may have, we may call it something else, but we had become a little bit more, there was more scrutiny during this time in recognition that it had not been done as thoroughly in previous years. And so we are covering a period to make sure that those folks who may feel like they were under the gun have an option if that was one of their concerns.
So just to translate that, the way I understand it is that prior to, 2 or 3, 4 years ago, the compliance was not being done the way it should have been. And so at a certain point, SMRHA, directed by the County Housing Authority and the Tyrant Housing Authority, directed them to actually go through compliance. So it wasn't that we were more strict than we should have been, or, it was just that we were finally getting that job done. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
And so it covers that time period as well. And then it also covers a legal time period of statute of limitations for property transactions. So. Okay. So without any other questions, comments, I just want to talk a little bit about the upcoming compliance process because we're intertwining something into a process that's already, can be stressful, can be difficult, and we hope to make it as easy as possible. So our compliance process is scheduled for 2025, and we're slated to begin the county compliance effort in mid-September. So the materials for compliance for any of these deed restrictions are fundamentally the same or very similar. So when you are requested to submit your compliance paperwork, it's not going to be significantly different from restriction to restriction, and should not have an impact your selection potentially to revert shouldn't have a significant impact on difference in your paperwork for compliance, so to speak. And for most owners, the compliance process will not change. And we said that this morning, if the commissioners decide to take the staff recommendation and go with those 3 years, we have between 30 and 35 properties in that bunch. So the vast majority of folks through the compliance process, they'll get a notice that says reversions may be available for some specific cases, but they'll just have compliance as usual. And it would just be those 30 to 35 users who would have an additional option, and we'll talk about that, an additional window to make a decision on a reversion. Again, whenever we do make a decision, and I take your comments appropriately, Commissioner Brown, we're not going to resolve this today. Right? I'm not going to go write the press release later this afternoon, because it's kind of late, because I don't think we're there yet. But whenever we do get to the place where a decision is made on how we want to move forward, we will be issuing press releases. We will be drafting communications to homeowners and HOAs to make sure that the message is as clear as it can be. And I say as clear as it can be because, again, every single case can be so significantly nuanced. And we'll be working on templates to make sure that we can get the documents signed that will need to be signed, get them recorded. Everything will have the appropriate legal effect, and we will be able to move ahead. We will be preparing pre-compliance notices that will talk about the reversions, as I mentioned. And conceptually, we're trying to identify a 60-day period where folks who get that notice would have to review their options, think about it, and get back to the county. This is just a rough draft of what that compliance timeline could look like, where we would issue a pre-compliance mailer or notice to residents. And I mentioned this morning. I was informed that most of this is done via email. Good emails are had for most of the owners, and so it's done by email. And then if people don't get responses via email, they get a certified letter thereafter. So that's kind of how that would go. We'd send the mailer. Then about mid-month, we would send the compliance and option notices. You have 21 days to get your compliance information back to SMRHA for that regular process. And those who would be, who would have a potential reversion can send that back because it's going to be applicable to whichever path they choose. And then we would be asking those folks to get that back at 60 days, which if we followed this schedule would be mid-November. So. And just the last point, if we send a reversion notice and we get no response, the existing deed restriction would just continue. And that, and the presentation.
Okay.
Happy to go back, answer any questions.
Lance and Galena, do you have any questions? No?
No, thanks, Jared.
Yes.
Second time's a charm.
It's way better than this morning.
Yeah.
Of
More is better.
clarification.
But Maura, yes, please.
So in regards to the types of reversion iterations that we might have, so it could be covenant to land use code or covenant to covenant. We aren't talking about land use code to land use code, because the whole basis of this concern, or why we've been looking into this, is that we've heard people were required to sign the covenant. That's not a concern if someone's still on the land use code. So we're not looking at properties that are still on the land use code, because they are presumably still on whatever version was first applied to that property. So that's just to clarify that for people. If you're on the land use code still, that's what you will stay on.
That's an important point. I thought I heard the third scenario that Jared said was someone who might have gone land use code to covenant. Does that person exist? Oh, sorry, covenant to land use code. Are there any people who were on the covenant? I'm seeing vigorous no head shaking. Okay, so there really are just two
And
scenarios.
based on the timeline, that I just don't see when that would ever have been a
Yeah,
possibility.
I just wanted to
right?
clarify. Okay, so it's, you might have been on the land use code and gone to the covenant, or you might have been on one covenant and gone to another covenant. Those are the two scenarios that could potentially be eligible for reversion.
And-
Jake, we're gonna do public comment in just a minute. And same thing,
Okay.
sorry, yeah.
And I will point out, I made that rubric in my head when we were still talking about can a property go from the covenant to the land use code? And we did ask that legal question and the answer was no.
Okay,
So
okay,
Because the covenants terminate the land use code
okay,
Right.
for that particular property.
okay, all right, good. Anything else from staff or commissioners? Okay, so just,
I thought it might be helpful for the folks that are just joining us to hear some of the questions that were raised. And so I know Jared has a list, I have a list, so you can add where I misspeak. But the number one question from all respondents and request was for the County Housing Authority to go beyond the 3-year look back. We heard that from multiple people. I don't know how, I didn't see some of these asked from multiple people, but that one definitely was. Some of the other ones were requests for us to have conversations with HOAs to explain and to hear what their concerns are, given the time frame we took to come back to the public. They kind of want some increased time frame for us to have this engagement and education with them
oh, okay.
about how it might impact them.
I heard that differently. And maybe, I think Shelley Duplan is on and maybe someone else from Lawson. I heard them just say, give us time to read and process and respond, but I didn't hear that they necessarily wanted us to go and speak with their homeowners. Is that what you were
And
suggesting?
maybe that was a part of the follow-up conversation I had had with the Lawson HOA. afterwards. Probably given that they are the largest deed restricted neighborhood in the unincorporated county.
Okay, fair. Mhm.
I heard a question or requesting a list of the county housing authority exceptions, and as well as folks that were denied an administrative appeal from SMRHA over time. We heard a request for SMRHA to review and enhance their policies on individual self-earned income earners, the 1099 versus W-2 wage earners, to have that further clarified and also evolved for, I know Mr. Brooks was talking about, the reality that more and more positions could be done partially remotely or otherwise, and for that to be given consideration. We heard the question about how are we going to correct the negative impacts to anybody that may not have been able to qualify because of instructions they were given from SMRHA at the time to purchase, rent, or potentially have lost their home. Those were some of the ones that I captured on my list. I don't know if you captured other questions or questions for the commissioner. And just for everybody to know, we said that a lot of these are further detailed conversations. Some of these have legal implications. And so we're going to come back at a next regular meeting, whether that's in 2 weeks or in a month, with answers to those questions, because we want to make sure that we can do the research, make a recommendation to the commissioners in a public meeting, and then they can have that discussion with the public. Jared, did I miss it?
I think the only other one that I had on my list was I mentioned there's some technical title work questions that were identified, and I think we've got some commitments to pry apart a little bit and work on to make sure that we can do this in the right way and keep track of title, and if there needs to be some sort of resource developed for those doing title work, we can talk about what that would look like. So.
Anything else anyone else wanted to bring up from this morning?
That captures my notes, and I know that there's folks in the audience that would like to speak. I'd like to hear them. I'd ask you if you have a different point than the questions that were brought up, or if you have a clarification, I'd love to hear it. If you have the exact same concern, I hope you heard clearly that we want to come back, we need to research, but we intend to try to dig into all those questions that we proposed this morning.
And you're welcome to reiterate it, but just if that's, don't use up your precious time to do that if you know that we're already addressing it. It's your call. Thanks, Lance. So just to remind us all how this is going to go, we're ready for our first round of public comments and questions. Each commenter or questioner will have 3 minutes. I will rotate between people in the room and people online. As we go through those questions and comments, it's not going to be a dialogue. We're going to be taking notes furiously of what those questions and comments are. If we are able to respond to them, once that portion of the public comment is complete, the commissioners and the staff will try to address those. If we are not able to, as Mike already said, we'll be coming back with you. Once the first round of public comments and questions is addressed, if there's still time, we'll have a second round for follow-up comments and questions from the public. We gave ourselves a couple hours. We started a little late because of the having to revisit the fire restrictions. So I would say we're good here till about 7:10. And again, this isn't ever your last opportunity to speak, but we just want to try to manage everybody's time here. So I usually start with people in the room. Is there anyone in the room? I know Jake, you or anybody else who had a question or a comment. Jake, would you like to go just because Lee's already commented? Yes, I would ask you to come up to the microphone, introduce yourself, and we will get to Lee. Introduce yourself, and then just mention, kind of any relevant affiliation or something like that. And the app up there runs the 3-minute clock, so.
All right, start. Jake McTeague, homeowner in El Tesoro up on Sarabia, so in the deed restricted. One, thanks for really looking at it and realizing that your compliance as county oversight was done incorrectly or not done properly in the past. I think a lot of people here want to hear that we were wrong as a county. We made mistakes. We're sorry. So I think that's something that you guys do need to say. You didn't make the mistake. People before made the mistake. We purchased our home in 2015. I believe we were on the land use code. When we got to the closing table or the day before, we were handed the covenant, which was from 2010. The previous owners, they were on the land use code from 01 or something like that. And we were told we had to sign it. We were not given a choice. So I did not grant consent. I was told by county as well as by SMRHA that I had to sign it. So I don't even understand why there's an option of just going back 3 years. I think everything just needs to go back to what the original land use code was for whatever specific development we're speaking of. So obviously I'm El Tesoro, but whatever Lawson may be in these other ones. I don't know anyone that would place a more restrictive covenant on their property at the point of sale of buying it. Maybe they would, but I would think that would probably be 99% of people that would not go ahead and do that. So I think there should be, just out of good faith by the county and the BOCC and moving forward, making this right, that there should be a full reversal for everyone. Thank you.
Just catching up with my notes. Okay. I will move to online. I see Shelley Duplan has her hand up. Shelley, welcome, unmute, show us your video if you'd like. And your
Okay. All right. Hi, thank you. Shelley Duplan, El Tesoro Ranch Homeowners Company. I have several key points to make. I did attend the morning session and I've had a few hours to digest some of the presentation materials. And first and foremost, I would just say to all of you on the BOCC and the county staff, and thanking you for the time and consideration of all of these concerns brought before you. I know it's a lot of work, but my key points is first the 3-year statute of limitations. And it seems that you're basing that on some sort of Colorado law regarding standard real estate transactions, including some other kind of county processes based on the time frame of enhanced compliance and or the applicable period of the newest covenant. There's nothing standard that's happened here, and that, you know, what's transpired are some serious considerations, and saying that the county is only obligated to revert deed restriction agreements that were really forced upon buyers by the county at the time of purchase is just not right. Instead, the Colorado statute, a property owner should have 3 years after the date of discovery when the injury, loss, damage, or conduct giving rise to the cause of action is discovered or should have been discovered by the exercise of reasonable diligence. So in this context, injury just means legal injury, and therefore a statute of limitation begins to run when a claimant has knowledge of acts which would have put a reasonable person on notice of the nature of the injury. And so I just put that out there. There's case law on it. It was a similar situation that we dealt with at Aldosoro Ranch with the affordable housing impact fee refunds. There was an initial 2-year statute of limitations on refunds, and that was rescinded. And those refunds went back in time since they were improperly charged. I just would strongly suggest that you eliminate that 3-year statute of limitations entirely. And like what Jake just said, you must allow that reversion for every eligible property. So and just kind of a little bit of a open Pandora's box. There's some strong feelings from some property owners, deed restrictions that signed on to that original 2010 deed restriction covenant that I'm being told or that were convinced incorrectly by the county at that time that in order to stave off additional changes to the land use code, they should sign on to this 25-page deed restriction agreement. They too should be given the opportunity of reversion, because really they should have been under that original land use code that says that the changes can't be applied to them without their consent. Switching from that,
Shelley,
oh,
that's the end of the 3 minutes, sorry, but if you could save that, we'll probably come back to that in the second round, or if we don't have tons more public comment, we will certainly let you complete that. It's just if I
sounds
get
good. I'm
more
done
time,
on
I
the
gotta get.
3-year. I'll try again if there's time.
Okay, thank you. And I'll bring it back actually before the end of this phase if we don't have too many people. I just don't want to have to let everybody speak over. So
Understood.
thank you. Anybody else in the room have a comment? Lee Rufa, please come on up and introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Lee Rufa. I'm an owner in the Aldosoro subdivision. And this is more of about a comment and questions based on my experience dealing with Regional Housing Authority for the past 2.5 years. 2.5, 3 years ago, I was put under the compliance gun. I complied with how my deed restriction was done. I was dealt with pretty harsh hand from the, at that time, Director of Housing, and then followed by the attorney. To make a long story short, a year later, we were able to come to a resolution to it. But one thing that I've noticed, and I'm starting to hear the same undertones now, is that no one's taking responsibility for their actions. My deed restriction, and I talked to some close friends of mine, they're in this room, and I said, you guys are doing this wrong. This is what I signed on for, and they're trying to make me comply based on this. 3 years later, 2.5 years later, I was right. And I haven't heard an apology. Just like what Jake was saying, is that the county made a mistake. It was a pretty egregious mistake. And now we're dealing with this. And I heard Maura say, anybody that signed off on the covenant is not applicable to go back to the land use code. Well, does that include duress, being lied to, saying this is the only way? You know, Maura just got here, so she doesn't understand the history that I have in this town. Jared's only been in town 1.5 years. And every one of us has heard from the housing authority and from other people pushing the covenants down our throat that if you sign off on this, we're not going to touch this. And a few of us didn't listen. and we just flat out ignored you. So now here we are. We're trying to use the legal excuse. Like when I was trying to say, hey, I want to file a complaint against the housing director. How do I do this? And lo and behold, there was no process in place. Remember, Mike?
Yeah.
You looked at it and you're like, this was a mistake. It was an oversight. And so we had to work through that process. And so now I'm going, you can't change back? Well, why not? Every one of those people who are on the covenant should have somebody call them, not review their documents, not go back and see what's online, but pick up the phone and do an accountability survey. Because right now, all I'm hearing is, we got 3 years. That's what our attorneys say we should do. This is not about what we should do. This is about doing what's right for our community. I'm retired from regional housing authorities aspect, so my compliance is easy to deal with. I'm here because what I call the gross oversight by the county. There's strong overhand how they dealt with affordable housing. And honestly, they've gotten caught with their hands in the pie. And so now we're here to make change. And you guys have come such a long way, but it's only part of the way. We have 270 residences in this county. We have hundreds of people that we've dealt with. How are you guys going to deal with those people? This is not cram it down your throat in 90 days. This is about going back to the board one step at a time, reviewing each process one step at a time and go back to. Even Jared on his second presentation made mistakes. He comes out talking about what the land use code applies to. Maura was very clear this morning. It runs with the land from the time that subdivision was brought into play. He brought up when the house is built. He brought up all the amendments. This is a really clear thing. There's only 5 or so different areas. Lawson Hill is going to have their simple land use code. Al DeSoro is going to have their simple land use code. And there's going to be a lot of amendments in between that don't apply to anything. They were just made there because as Maura put down, it runs with the county, it runs with the property, it doesn't change. So we're making this more difficult. The question is now how you as a county want to move forward and do right by our community. Because for my last 2.5 years of sitting in this room, watching everybody deflect, watching everybody say, not me, you're kind of there. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Lee. The next person I have online is Matthew Legault. Matthew, go ahead and unmute and turn on your video if you would like.
I just wanted to point out there was one other thing that was mentioned this morning that I wanted to highlight. There were policies implemented by the housing authority that violated the covenant. And the covenant says that it can't be changed. And so they were trying to use policy as a way to get around their inability to change the covenant via law via policy. And then I'd also like to say, as far as with the all the things that you're asking about is for further, I would be happy to help with as an attorney and help with the, like, for example, the recordings and that kind of stuff as well.
Can you be a little more clear about that? please?
Like this morning, you got there was talk about with the title agencies and whatnot and those kinds of things, figuring out how all that should be done and whatnot. I'd be happy to help with any advice I can give on that.
Thank you, Matthew. Anybody else in the room like to speak? Mark, not to put you on the spot, but I know you had a clarification question that you got it? Okay. Anybody else online? Shelley, yes, let's finish your comment. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for a second opportunity. I really appreciate it. Just a couple other points I want to make. And that is what Matthew had just kind of touched on briefly about policies and procedures and maybe even enforcement rules. And I'm really not clear about how you can say the compliance angle is not, it won't be significantly different for land use code versus deed restriction covenant. You know, and I'm going to use Lee Rufa as an example, who's under the land use code that has, you know, just a handful of limited rules, and how, you know, the enforcement and the policies can be applied to him versus, you know, a 25-page, you know, deed restriction agreement. So I think there's some big confusion about that, and making sure that there's not, you know, sort of a violation of some of those original land use code people, that the policies are not encroaching on their rights. So I think that there needs to be some clarification there. And also, I just have to say again, I said it this morning, that this is such a significant amount of information for owners to digest. And I know that the county, you all have said, you know, that there's going to be time to digest this. You know, the HOAs, we're going to need time to reach out to all of our owners. Obviously, we've only have a handful of deed restricted owners online and in person, and allowing the HOA some time, like a month or two, to be able to go back to our communities, be able to have a board meeting, usually, which is once a month, to be able to try to understand, you know, some of these changes is crucial. You know, and so I think that's needed. And another thing that's needed is those list of exceptions. And if you want to, you know, have fair treatment of everyone, what are those exceptions that have been granted? What, you know, what is possible for people to ask for that have been granted in the past? And it's important about that clarification, W-2s versus business owners. And then, you know, it's going to be a difficult road on those title commitments and trying to make sure everyone's protected. So it's a long list. And it's and I think we are all encouraged that we're communicating and that we can all work together on solving these problems together. And I think there's a way of doing that. So thank you.
Thank you, Shelley. Looking for hands online, hands in the room, not seeing any. Oh,
One last question. Quick.
sure. Come on back up, Lee.
So another thing I forgot to mention is that we're here today because what I call the oversight on the Board of County Commissioners and the attorney.
Make sure you're speaking
Oh,
into the
sorry.
microphone.
We're here today because of what I call the problems in the past and how people were dealt with. And it wasn't until how they dealt with me that we started getting some oversight with a process online of how to file a complaint. But more importantly, if we have that, who is this regional housing authority, including their attorney, accountable to? Our last regional housing authority attorney put us in a lot of this situation. And it wasn't until you guys as a group hired 3 different independent groups to review the decisions that she had made to find us right here, right now. And so I'm asking you as a county, we can't have this again. We can't have another housing authority attorney go off rogue, make her own decisions, and we do this whole thing all over again. We're really good about agreeing, like, yes, she's an attorney, we should accept that. Or what the housing authority director says, we should accept that. It took me challenging the system to get us where we are today. And it was an uphill battle, and I'm glad I did it. And now I'm asking you as a Board of County Commissioners, what is your guys' plan to oversight these people? Is it going to be compliance checks by asking the members of the community how they're treated? Is it going to be sending out the attorney's review to an outside legal counsel to see if they're on track?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think I can answer the first question. Let's go back to the beginning, and see what we've got. We have, I guess, a question I saw or heard from Maura was, the interpretation of the 3-year statute of limitations. And, does that kick in, at the time of the transfer of ownership? Or does it kick in, as Shelley believes or stated, at the time that the buyer has knowledge of the injury?
I think I would prefer to go back and discuss that question with Lane Thomason
Sure.
internally, and I think that's a question that is absolutely subject to argument and interpretation.
Okay, so I think that that's something we'll get back to the board and the public on a little later. And I do appreciate that you're gonna check in with Lane. And I guess that actually, I'll just bring it up now. The question that Lee just brought up of who is the San Miguel Regional Housing Authority attorney accountable to? That attorney is accountable to that board. I think that the attorney that you had the most trouble with was the attorney for the County Housing Authority. Sorry, these are just lots of acronyms and 3 different lawyers. That attorney is accountable to us, the Board of County Commissioners. And as when I was on the part of the time that I've been on the Board of County Commissioners, when we had a question about that, that attorney's interpretation, we asked our county attorney. So that is the check that we have. And
How do we get from there to
And-
3 separate independent legal counsels to sit there and go,
Okay.
"Oh, they were wrong"?
okay, well, what happened was we had public meetings, as we do, and that's the way government works. We have, work that is happening by the boards and commissions, and for good reason, we have public comment. The public comes and they give their opinion, they ask questions, and there were enough questions and opinions voiced that this board, well, I guess it might have been Chris rather than Galena, requested outside counsel. So it worked the way it's supposed to work. We have a separate attorney for the San Miguel County Housing Authority. We questioned her interpretation. We asked our county attorney. She agreed with it. The public questioned those interpretations. And so the board asked our staff to get outside counsel. We got the first one who didn't agree with our counsel. We all right, that's 1 versus 2. So we asked for a second one. The second one was unclear. So we asked for a third one, and that third person also disagreed with those 2 attorneys. So I would argue that the system worked exactly the way it's supposed to work. And in a democracy, we rely on the public to bring these issues to our attention. We don't sit over the shoulder of our attorneys and question everything we do, but we do ask hard questions in these meetings, as you've heard, and we do listen to the public. And if we need to follow up, we do. And that is what happened. So I think the system is working. It's clumsy, it's painful, it takes time, but that's the system that we've been dealt, thank goodness. And here we are. So if anybody feels differently about accountability of the County Housing Authority attorney, please help me out here, staff, but that's my interpretation. In terms of how we hold the San Miguel Regional Housing Director accountable, there's a board. And that board oversees that person. They hire and fire that person, they review that person. And as you know, we also have many methods for for submitting complaints of any nature, which go directly to the 2 county managers. We have appeals processes. There are also, if you get through all of the county appeals process, there's our district court, and that goes on and on. So these people are absolutely held accountable. And again, yeah, so that's my response to those 2 questions. Does anybody else want to weigh in on that one?
I think the point you brought up about filing a formal complaint is through the Regional Housing Authority is another fairly new conduit to bring to the attention of the board any issues or, discontent among homeowners that we could certainly become
Yes.
aware of. And
Yes. And, I think this whole thing is a little clumsy. It is hard work, but the reality is this is pretty cutting edge work that we're doing here. I mean, our deed restriction was built, what was it, in 2001, right? No, sorry, 1991. I actually signed that first deed restriction when I bought Fairway 4, which was freaking scary. Here we were buying in with all of our money to an unproven market. And so as we've gone through this process over the last 35 years, we're learning, right? And mistakes have been made. And I'm not ready now to apologize for the county. I think that's something we need to all think a little bit about. But I just want to level set the fact that this is people doing their best in an evolving market and an evolving situation. And the whole point is, as Jared started out with, is to provide housing for locals and for our workforce. And so there's no malintent here. This is people, smart people trying really hard and doing their best. And yeah, maybe mistakes have been made, and we are owning those here today by trying to address them. But to suggest that well, I don't think it has been suggested. So I think that's just the reality of trying hard things, among the first people to try hard things. So, what else? Any other questions that came up that somebody here wants to try to address? No?
I think we have a good list from the morning, and we've heard
Okay.
corroboration of those same concerns, as well as some additional ones that we're gonna be working on.
Okay.
And we're gonna be coming back to the board in a near-term, regular meeting.
Okay.
Continue discussion.
Let's talk about next steps in a minute, because I want to hear from the other commissioners what they think that those should be. But I do want to offer a formal second round of public comments and questions. I know some of you had a couple of opportunities just because of timing, but is there anybody else who'd like to speak from the public at this round? Okay, great. So yeah, I guess we want to talk about next steps. We have some specific suggestions that have been made by the staff here on those couple of pages. And then we've had all sorts of comments and questions from the public. My question to the other commissioners is, do you feel ready to make decisions, or would you like to extend this process? I told you how I felt at the beginning of the meeting, but I just want to hear from you guys.
I agree that we're nowhere near a decision.
Nowhere near.
Okay.
This has just led me to, but there's way more to mull over here, and we need time to do it properly and with, a mindful approach.
Yeah, and I definitely respect the fact that the public wants to have some time too. So we'll definitely allow for that. So as I was just thinking about this, we have, some questions that we can probably get answered fairly quickly. But probably the public and the HOAs and so forth would like to have more time than that. They can't do it as quickly as Shelley pointed out. They've got to talk to the homeowners and talk to have board meetings. But do we want to do this in 2 steps where the staff comes back and answers some questions so that everybody has that information? Or do we want to just wait and have another round like this in a month or 2, or whenever how much we time? How do you guys feel about that?
Well, we answer the questions as quickly as we can, because then if there's a board meeting, they'll have the best and most updated information and not waste time trying to ponder something when we're holding an answer.
I was thinking the same, Lance. I just know that would be another public meeting, so another meeting for everybody to attend, but I think let's have as many public meetings as we can, right? So that everybody weighs in. Okay, so do you agree with that?
Yes,
Elena?
yeah, within reason, right? I mean, gathering everybody to
Yeah.
join a meeting and making time out of their busy lives and work schedules is challenging. So I think setting, 2 or 3 potential meetings moving forward is reasonable for the public.
Well,
and our
maybe-
staff.
Okay, that sounds good. Mike?
Mr. Brown, I might suggest that we target July 16th, because
And that's for your, the staff response to
for
the
the staff
questions.
response, the staff response to the questions that were received, and a potentially revised recommendation for the commissioners.
Okay,
If that works for you too. I'm just worried, I know that there's gonna be some weddings, there's going to be, and we have a compliance
Yeah.
that's set to kick off in September, and that is also tying up the town of Telluride's compliance too. So I don't want to extend this too long
That-
before we try and bring this to some conclusion so that communication can happen.
okay, that was my point too, is I really do like the idea of going through any reversions as we go through compliance. And so while I want to give everybody time, I do want to keep that as our target date. For getting, pardon me, these decisions made and everything tied up that we need to do logistically. So, but Mike, when you said July 16th, were you thinking again to respond to questions or for us to be ready to make a decision?
I would, to say to respond to questions. Really, these questions are leading into what your decision is going to be. So we're going
Yeah.
to say, if you want to go back to the very beginning of the first land use code and here's what that number is, here's the additional logistics it's going to take. Here's what potential legal
Mhm.
ramifications it may, or financial ramifications it may have for the county. That's the information I want to give to you guys so that you can say, okay, I'm gonna go 3 years, or I'm gonna go 6 years, or I'm gonna go back to the very beginning. And so that you have the knowledge of what it's gonna take to do that.
Okay, I'm just checking to see how many weeks that is. Today's
4
June
weeks.
18th, 4 weeks. Okay, so, oh, it's actually, wait, one, two,
Well,
okay. So no, it's 4 weeks. 25th, 2nd, 9th, 16th. Okay.
Yeah.
So I think what you're suggesting though is that we just do it all at once, that we have answers to the questions and revised recommendations and try to make a decision at that time.
Is that gonna address the HOA's requests to get all of this information, this initial information out to all the residents? Cause what I've heard
Right.
from them is that they need
More time.
more time to just.
Yeah.
Or I have a good suggestion that we present this on the 16th. And that we allow for the 2 more weeks until the 30th to have a final decision. So that if
Okay.
you have additional questions or there's additional public comment from the folks that haven't been in either of these two
Sure.
sessions.
But why do we need 4 weeks to get the initial questions answered?
I was gonna say if we.
I-
Could encourage the owners or the homeowners associations to provide us with any additional questions they have between now and. The 2nd or 7th, and that would. Give us, we can try to put all the questions together into one follow-up presentation. With, as Mike said, potentially some alternative recommendations.
Okay, so Shelley, is it all right? I guess if we just ask Shelley, because she's the one who has requested this time on behalf of a homeowners association,
As did Lawson.
as did Lawson, and
Mhm.
Lawson, is any, well, we have.
Yeah, we've got Annalise on the phone.
Okay, so maybe Annalise and Shelley would be helpful to get your input into that suggested schedule. This, again, that you guys would provide follow-up questions within 2 weeks, and then in 4 weeks, we would have answers to today's questions and those follow-up questions. And then we would and the staff would be able to also come back with some additional recommendations. It's not to say that that's the day we would make a decision. Is that correct, Mike? It's just that we would try to keep moving this along.
If I could speak up, I think 2 weeks is not enough time. I mean, 2 weeks for our owners to come together. I'm just saying for Aldosoro, and we have, 24. Lawson, it's going to take them, I think a little more than 2 weeks. I won't speak for them though. I mean, I would say at a minimum, we need, give us 4 weeks because we have to get everyone together. We've got to vet the issues. We have to talk about, what people's concerns are. And so, I mean, I guess at just trying to look at the schedule here, if you're trying to meet the target date of the 16th of July, if we can get things to you, and I'm opening up my calendar while I'm talking to you here, trying to look, if we can get, a time like, until July 14th, I don't know if that's enough time for you guys to distribute your information. That would give us at least 3 weeks to respond, and give you
Okay.
feedback.
All right, you know what? I'm just actually remembering that, Mike, the points that you reviewed, it's not like we're actually looking for information, right? I don't think there were any other sort of informational questions. It was more like, these are ways we would like you to handle this, right? So I don't know that we actually have more information to share. Like, we're not gonna, in 2 or 4 weeks, we're not gonna change our policies at SMRHA, right? Were there any just informational questions that were left hanging? I don't think there are.
Well, I think that what Mike was saying is that if we went with, say, Jake's proposal, or Lee's proposal, as I heard it, of going back to the dawn of time, so to speak. That has ramifications, and that Mike and the staff would like time to explore those thoroughly and give us the full packet of information on what that decision could entail, because it's going to affect our demographic, it's going to affect our housing program, or perhaps our housing stock. There's a lot of
Okay,
ways that
And we're likely to have to adjust our compliance timeline if we're talking about the difference between 35 owners and 200 plus owners.
exactly. Okay. So I'm actually just wondering if Shelley and everybody in the room, and online, why don't we just have another meeting in 4 weeks? And at that time, our staff could come
Yeah.
back with sort of an interpretation of those different options with potentially a revised suggestion for the board. The homeowners and public can, homeowners association and public can continue to share their concerns and questions. And then we can decide if we're ready to make a decision at that time. Does that sound right?
Sure, I think that I hear Shelley loud and clear that a month is a minimum amount of time for her 24 residents. I hope that Lawson can go in the same amount of time, and I would like to think that Annalise can get that word out and the Lawson board can help. And I'll commit to doing the same, so.
Okay. How does that sound to folks in the room?
I
I'm
think
seeing,
it sounds great. I just think putting an arbitrary. You guys spent 9 months or more, 3 different legal groups reviewing this thing. Mike is trying to do this compliance thing in September. That's his drop dead.
well,
Okay, but we never came to you saying, where's your information? Where's your information? You sprung it on us today. And now Mike.
We shared it, Lee, please. Choose your words.
You shared it with us today. And then Mike is saying, well, you have until September because we're gonna start.
Lee, we will absolutely change that if we need to, okay? What we're trying to do is to keep this moving because it has been a while. But as I've said this morning, and I'll say it again, we will give this as much time as we need to. Shelley suggested that a month would be adequate to come back and share additional questions and concerns. And so I think rather than having 2 different meetings with half the information and a third of the people, we will have, we'll kind of have another round just like this in a month. And if anybody who is here today or hears about this on the street in the next few days or over the course of the next 4 weeks would like to share additional comments or additional questions, we can take those on a continuous basis at bocc@sanmiguelcountyco.gov. So no one is being rushed, no one is being cut off. We're doing what we have to do just to keep the process moving. Mike?
So we were just making sure that folks knew it was those questions, comments, concerns to the BOCC at San Miguel County email. And then I was also just talking to Jared about, I think it'd be helpful to put his presentation on our website on the forefront so that folks who are tuning into this at whatever time can kind of walk through and see what those are.
I think that's a great idea. Where would that go on the website, Jared?
We put it under latest news, the first, as you scroll down on the
Yep.
main page, it has the first thing, the latest things
Great.
from the county.
And then when that's posted, let's get a social media post out and
Sure.
things like that, our
Yeah.
usual channels. That's great. And then the question is, did you think that the HOAs needed additional presentations to their homeowners, or could potentially people who weren't able to make this meeting either listen to the 2
Yes.
meetings or read that presentation? What was Annalise asking you for earlier, Mike?
Annalise.
Or somebody you said Lawson had requested that
Pam.
make a presentation to their homeowners?
Pam Hall was just saying that they're gonna need some time to disseminate this, and if they have needs of, could we help disseminate the information to her? I said,
Okay.
absolutely.
And she's aware of the YouTube option for people to watch these.
We'll promote
At
that
their-
in that news in the social.
So I think that'd be very helpful for people to just digest this information that weren't able to attend.
Perfect. Okay, that's great. And then on July 16th, I guess we'll have the 2 sessions again at 10 and 5. Does that work for people?
Yes.
Yes. Make it work.
Okay. All right, great. I think we're good. No action will be taken, but staff certainly has direction. And I think we are ready to shift out of Community Housing Authority back to BOCC. And now I'm ready for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second. How do you vote?
Aye.
Aye as well. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everybody, very much. For those who spent a lot of time with us today, there are a number of you in the room for both meetings, online for both meetings. Staff, thank you for the late day and happy Bluegrass.